The Galactic Confederation had been around for approximately 12,000 standard cycles, which was really just a fancy way of saying that various species had been arguing about trade routes and territorial disputes for longer than most civilizations could remember. In that time, they had seen it all. Or so they thought. Species that could breathe methane, species that reproduced by budding, species that communicated through bioluminescent flatulence. The galaxy was a weird place, and the Confederation prided itself on having categorized, analyzed, and assigned a threat level to every conceivable form of sentient life. Then humans showed up, and everyone had a good laugh. Not openly, of course. The Confederation was nothing if not diplomatically polite. But behind closed doors, in the bars that catered to silicon-based life forms, in the recreational centers where species went to blow off steam, the consensus was clear. Humans were adorable. Weak, fragile, short-lived little things that had somehow stumbled into faster-than-light travel despite having the structural integrity of overripe fruit. Their bones broke if you looked at them wrong. Their skin tore easier than tissue paper. They needed a laughably narrow range of temperatures to survive, required constant intake of both solids and liquids, and apparently died if they went without oxygen for more than a few minutes. The Vrexian ambassador had literally patted the human diplomatic envoy on the head during the first contact meeting. That had caused a minor incident, but the humans had been gracious about it, which only reinforced everyone's opinion that they were harmless. The Confederation's xenobiologists had filed their reports with barely concealed amusement. Humans were persistence hunters, which was a polite way of saying they were too slow and weak to catch anything, so they just followed it around until it died of exhaustion. They had virtually no natural defenses, no armor plating, no venom, no ability to regrow limbs, not even decent claws. Their evolutionary advantages were apparently sweating and having really good endurance for throwing things. Adorable. The military assessment was even more dismissive. Human musculature was pathetic compared to most species. The average Corinthian could lift 4 times what the strongest human could manage. The insectoid Zithra had exoskeletons that could deflect small arms fire. Even the Pluvians, who were basically ambulatory water balloons, had the advantage of being able to reform after taking damage. Humans broke. Easily. Their own planetary gravity was barely worth mentioning, and they had evolved in what amounted to a nursery compared to most inhabited worlds. So when the humans petitioned to enter a representative in the trials of dominance, the Confederation's response was somewhere between confused and concerned. The trials were an ancient tradition, dating back to the early days when species settled their differences through ritualized combat instead of the more civilized method of passive-aggressive trade sanctions. These days, the trials were mostly ceremonial, a way for species to show off their genetic superiority and earn bragging rights for the next solar cycle. It was all in good fun, assuming your definition of fun included watching massive warriors beat each other into unconsciousness while crowds cheered. The trials were brutal. Participants had died, regularly. Even with the medical technology available, sometimes the damage was too severe, too instant, too catastrophic. And the humans wanted to send someone? The High Arbiter, a Velkari whose species had been around since before most others had invented the wheel, had actually laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a full, genuine laugh that made his gill slits flutter. "Surely you understand the nature of these competitions," he had said to the human coordinator, trying to be diplomatic while also questioning their sanity. "This is not a sporting event by your standards. This is combat, real combat." The human coordinator, A thin male with graying hair and an expression that suggested he had stopped being surprised by anything years ago, had simply smiled. "We understand completely. We have a volunteer who is quite eager to participate." "A volunteer," the High Arbiter had repeated slowly. "You do understand that volunteers can die, yes? That their next of kin will receive their remains in whatever state they happen to be in after a Corinthian has used them as a stress ball?" "We understand." The High Arbiter had looked at his fellow council members, who looked back with expressions ranging from concern to morbid curiosity. The Vrexian representative had been particularly interested, probably already calculating the betting odds. "Very well," the High Arbiter had finally said. "But we will require extensive waivers. We cannot have humanity claiming mistreatment when your representative is hospitalized within the first 30 seconds. The humans had signed everything put in front of them without even reading it. That had been 2 weeks ago. Now, in the grand arena of First Blood on the neutral station of Convergence Point, representatives from 100 different species had gathered to watch the trials. The arena itself was a masterpiece of engineering, a circular combat zone 300 meters in diameter, with energy shielding that could contain everything from plasma explosions to gravitational anomalies. The floor was made of a smart material that could shift between different terrains at the judge's discretion. Seating rose in steep tiers around the arena, and every seat was filled. The betting pools had reached astronomical levels. The Vrexians were running a particularly active market, with odds constantly updating on massive holographic displays. The odds for the human representative were, to put it mildly, not encouraging. Most bookies were offering 1,000-to-1 returns on a human victory, and even that was considered generous. Some weren't even accepting bets on the human winning, only on how quickly they would lose. The tournament format was straightforward. 16 competitors, single elimination, no weapons beyond what a species could naturally produce or wear as part of their cultural tradition. Fights continued until one participant yielded, was rendered unconscious, or died. Medical teams stood ready with regeneration tanks and trauma surgery capabilities. But everyone understood that sometimes even the best medicine arrived too late. The participants had been announced 3 days prior, and the roster read like a greatest hits collection of the galaxy's most dangerous species. Krathix, the Unyielding, a Corinthian whose species averaged 2.5 meters tall and could bend steel with their bare hands. Sesisral, a Zithra warrior, whose exoskeleton had never been breached in 17 previous trials. Velkor 9 Scars, a Velkari combat specialist who had earned each scar by surviving fights that would have killed anyone else. The list went on, each name accompanied by a record of victories that would make any sane person reconsider their life choices. And then, at the bottom of the roster, with almost no information attached, Riko Martinez, human, age 28 standard years, which was barely past adolescence for most species. Height 1.7 meters, laughably small. Weight 72 kilograms, concerningly light. Combat record unknown. The lack of information had spawned endless speculation. Some thought it was a psychological tactic, keeping her background mysterious to unsettle opponents. Others figured the humans simply didn't have much to report because their combat sports were probably about as dangerous as pillow fighting. A few xenopsychology experts had suggested that maybe humans didn't understand what they had signed up for, that their cultural context for combat trials was different from the Confederation's. And this was all a tragic misunderstanding waiting to happen. When Riko Martinez finally walked into the arena for the opening ceremonies, the crowd's reaction was a mixture of curiosity and pity. She was small, not just by galactic standards, But even for a human, she wore simple combat attire. Nothing fancy, just flexible material that allowed movement. Her hair was dark and pulled back into a practical knot. Her skin was tan, marked with a few scars that suggested she had seen some kind of action, though nothing compared to the warriors around her. She moved with a loose, relaxed gait that made her look more like she was heading to a casual workout than a potentially lethal combat tournament. Next to her, Krathix the Unyielding looked like a mountain. The Corinthian warrior was covered in thick, gray hide that had the texture of stone, with muscles that bulged even when relaxed. His hands could easily crush a human skull, and everyone knew it. He looked down at Riko with something approaching concern. "Little human," he rumbled, his voice like grinding rocks. "You should not be here. This is not a place for your kind." Riko looked up at him and smiled. It was not a nervous smile, not an uncertain smile, but the kind of smile someone gets when they know something you don't. "Thanks for the concern, big guy. I'll try not to break anything important." Krathix blinked, confused whether she was worried about breaking herself or breaking him, and decided she must mean the former. He nodded solemnly, accepting her bravery even if he thought it was misplaced. The opening ceremonies were elaborate, as they always were. Each species representative was introduced with great fanfare, their achievements listed, their victories celebrated. When it came time for Riko's introduction, the announcers seemed almost apologetic. Representing humanity, making her first appearance in the trials of dominance, Riko Martinez. The applause was polite, but uncertain. A few humans in the crowd cheered enthusiastically, but they were vastly outnumbered. The holographic displays showed her image alongside her basic statistics, which looked pathetic next to everyone else's. No special abilities listed, no remarkable physical traits. Just a small human who apparently thought she could stand toe-to-toe with the galaxy's finest warriors. The first-round matchups were drawn randomly, and when Riko's name appeared next to Thorax the Breaker, a Zithra warrior known for his aggressive style and complete lack of mercy, the crowd actually gasped. Not in excitement, but in sympathy. Thorax was a killing machine, pure and simple. His exoskeleton was reinforced with metallic compounds that made it harder than most armor. His mandibles could shear through bone. His forearms gave him attacking options that most species couldn't counter. He had won 3 previous trials and had never failed to hospitalize an opponent. Betting on the match was almost non-existent. Who would bet against an outcome that was essentially guaranteed? The arena floor shifted to a neutral, flat terrain. No obstacles, no advantages, just open space for combat. Riko walked to her starting position, still looking relaxed, still moving like this was just another day. Across from her, Thorax clicked his mandibles together in a gesture that was probably meant to be intimidating, his compound eyes reflecting the arena lights in 1,000 different directions. The referee, a neutral AI construct without physical form, announced the rules. Combat continues until yield, unconsciousness, or death. Medical intervention available. Begin on my mark. Riko rolled her shoulders, bounced on her toes a few times, and took a stance that looked almost casual. She raised her hands in what experts recognized as a fighting guard, but her posture was loose, ready. Thorax lowered himself into an aggressive posture, his forearms spreading wide. Begin. What happened next would be analyzed, debated, and replayed approximately 10 million times across Confederation networks in the following weeks. Thorax charged. It was a standard opening for his species, using superior mass and strength to overwhelm opponents immediately. He covered the distance between them in less than 2 seconds, his arms reaching out to grab, crush, and tear. Riko didn't run, didn't dodge to the side, didn't do any of the sensible things a smaller, weaker opponent should do. She stepped forward, inside his reach, and punched him. It was not a wild haymaker. It was not a desperate flail. It was a perfectly executed punch, her whole body rotating into it, her hips driving the motion, her shoulder and arm extending at precisely the right moment. Her fist, laughably small by galactic standards, impacted Thorax's thorax. The irony was not lost on commentators, with a sharp, cracking sound. Thorax stopped mid-charge. His forearms dropped. He made a sound that no Zithra had ever made in the arena before, a kind of wheezing, clicking gasp. Then Riko hit him again. Same spot, same devastating precision. And again. 3 punches in under 2 seconds, each one landing on the same point on his exoskeleton. On the third punch, something cracked. Not broke, not shattered, but definitely cracked. The sound echoed through the arena, picked up by 1,000 microphones. Thorax stumbled backward, his arms clutching at his chest, his mandibles clicking in what any xenobiologist would recognize as distress. His legs, normally so stable, wobbled. Riko didn't pursue. She stepped back, returned to her ready stance, and waited. The crowd was silent, completely, utterly silent. This was not how this was supposed to go. This was not how physics worked. A human, a fragile little human, had just hurt a Zithra, had just made Thorax the breaker stagger. Thorax recovered, his warrior pride overriding his shock. He charged again, but this time with more caution. Keeping his wounded section guarded, he feinted with his upper arms, trying to create an opening. Riko moved, not fast by Confederation standards, but efficiently. She slipped his attacks by centimeters, wasted no movement, stayed just out of range until she saw what she was looking for. Then she stepped in again and drove her fist into his leg joint, right where the exoskeleton had natural flexibility. Thorax's leg buckled. He crashed to one knee, and Riko was already moving, circling to his side. Another punch, this one to the side of his head, right where his compound eyes met his skull structure. Not hard enough to cause permanent damage, but hard enough that his vision clearly blurred. The Zithra warrior swung wildly, trying to catch her, to grab her, to use his superior strength. But strength meant nothing if you couldn't land a hit, and Riko flowed around his attacks like water. Every time he overextended, she punished him with another precise strike. Not random violence, but calculated damage, each punch targeting joints, weak points, the spots where even exoskeletons had to bend. 3 minutes into the match, Thorax was breathing hard, his movements sluggish. 5 minutes in, he could barely stand. Riko had barely broken a sweat. When she hit him one final time, a thunderous right cross to his already cracked chest piece, Thorax went down and didn't get up. His legs twitched, but he was done. Unconscious or too hurt to continue, it didn't matter. The referee's voice cut through the stunned silence. Thorax unable to continue. Victory to Riko Martinez. The medical team rushed in immediately, their equipment already scanning Thorax for damage. He would live, probably even fight again, but his pride would take longer to heal than his exoskeleton. Riko walked back to her corner, barely winded. She accepted a water bottle from her human support team and drank like someone who had just finished a light jog, not someone who had just beaten one of the galaxy's most feared warriors. The crowd finally found its voice. The reaction was chaos. Some species cheered, caught up in the excitement of an upset. Others shouted in disbelief, demanding investigations into whether the human had used illegal augmentation. The Vrexian betting pools went berserk, algorithms scrambling to recalculate odds that had just been proven catastrophically wrong. In the luxury boxes where the Confederation's elite watched, the High Arbiter sat very still. Next to him, a Velkari xenobiologist was frantically pulling up data on human biology, his gills fluttering in agitation. "This should not be possible," the xenobiologist muttered. "Human bone density is inferior. Their muscle mass is insufficient. Their striking power should not be able to breach Zithra exoskeleton armor." And yet, the High Arbiter said quietly, it did. Down in the arena, workers were repairing the floor where Thorax had fallen. Riko had already left the combat zone, heading back to whatever preparation area the humans had been assigned. She hadn't gloated, hadn't celebrated, hadn't done anything except treat the whole thing like it was routine. The second-round matches proceeded over the next 2 days, and the galaxy watched with new eyes. Suddenly, humans were interesting, dangerous even. The xenobiologists worked overtime, reassessing every assumption they had made. It turned out they had missed a few things. Yes, human bones were less dense than many species, but they were also more flexible, harder to shatter completely. Yes, human muscles were smaller, but they had a peculiar property. They could generate enormous force in short bursts, especially when properly trained. Humans had evolved to throw, to strike, to deliver impact far beyond what their size suggested. Their hands, seemingly fragile, had evolved specifically for precision gripping and, it turned out, making very effective fists. More importantly, humans had pain tolerance that was genuinely abnormal. Most species, when injured, instinctively protected the wound. Humans got angry. Their adrenal systems pumped combat drugs into their bloodstreams that let them ignore damage that would incapacitate others. They had this bizarre ability to compartmentalize pain, to acknowledge it existed, and then just keep functioning anyway. And then there was the training factor. Humans had been fighting each other for their entire evolutionary history. They had refined combat into an art form, developed hundreds of different martial systems, each designed to let smaller, weaker individuals defeat larger, stronger opponents. While other species relied on natural advantages, humans had spent millennia learning how to punch above their weight class. Literally. Riko's second match was against a Pluvian named Cascade of Stars. Pluvians were gelatinous, could absorb and disperse impact force through their bodies, and could regenerate from almost any injury that didn't destroy their central core. Fighting them was like fighting water, frustrating and seemingly pointless. The match lasted 47 seconds. Riko spent the first 20 seconds analyzing Cascade's movement patterns, watching how the Pluvian flowed and reformed. Then she did something that made every Pluvian in the audience scream warnings that arrived too late. She grabbed Cascade's central core directly, yanked it out of the surrounding gel, and squeezed. Not hard enough to crush it, which would have been fatal. Just hard enough to make it very, very clear that she could. Cascade yielded immediately, reforming around Riko's arm in a gesture of submission. The crowd was beyond shock now. They were entering territory that required entirely new categories of reaction. Her third match, the quarterfinal, was against a Velkari named Sharpfin Cuts Deep. The Velkari were aquatic warriors, faster in water than most species were on land, with blade-like fins that could slice through armor. The arena floor was modified to include a large water section, giving Sharpfin what everyone assumed was an insurmountable home field advantage. Riko dove in without hesitation. The fight in the water was brief and brutal. Sharpfin was faster, that was undeniable. But water also meant resistance, meant that speed had to overcome drag. and Riko moved like she had been born in water. Her human swimming ability translating to an environment where she was more mobile than anyone expected. She used the water itself as a weapon, creating currents and eddies that disrupted Sharpfin's attacks. When she finally caught the Velkari, she dragged him to the surface and held his head above water, controlling him completely. In the water, Sharpfin was superior. Above it, gasping for air, he was helpless. He yielded, confused, and humiliated. By the time the semi-finals arrived, the betting pools had completely reversed. Humans were no longer the joke. They were the terror. Riko's odds had gone from 1,000 to 1 long shots to making her the favorite in most markets. The Confederation was having a collective crisis. Her semi-final opponent was Krathix the Unyielding, the massive Corinthian who had expressed concern for her on the first day. He no longer looked concerned. He looked focused, determined, and had clearly studied her previous fights. He would not underestimate her. He would not charge recklessly. He would fight smart. The match was the longest of the tournament so far, lasting nearly 15 minutes. Krathix used his reach advantage, keeping her at distance, forcing her to work for every opening. His stone-like hide absorbed her strikes better than any previous opponent, and his strength meant that even a glancing blow from him could be devastating. Riko took hits, real hits. A backhand caught her shoulder and sent her rolling across the arena floor. A grab caught her leg and slammed her down hard enough that the impact resonated through the smart floor. The medical monitors screamed warnings about fractures and internal damage. She got up every time. This was what finally broke the last of the galaxy's misconceptions about humans. Not that they could fight, not that they could win, but that they could take damage that should have ended the fight and just keep coming. Riko's face was bloodied. Her breathing labored. Her movements showed pain with every step. And she advanced anyway. Krathix, for all his power, had never faced anything like it. Every species he knew fought until the pain was too much, until survival instinct overrode pride. Humans apparently missed that memo. This small, fragile creature just would not stay down. When Riko finally found her opening, it was because Krathix hesitated. Just for a moment, he pulled a punch that would have caved in her ribs, some part of his warrior's honor unwilling to kill someone so much smaller. That hesitation was all she needed. She got inside his guard, and what followed was a systematic destruction of his balance and structure. She couldn't overpower him, so she targeted his joints, his knees, his elbows. She made him collapse under his own weight. When Krathix fell the final time, he looked up at her with something approaching wonder. "How?" he asked simply. Riko, breathing hard through what was probably a cracked rib, smiled that same knowing smile. "We're persistence hunters, remember? We just don't know when to quit." Krathix laughed, a deep rumbling sound, and yielded. Honorably, respectfully, but completely. The finals were set. Riko Martinez versus Sesral, the Zithra champion who had won 5 consecutive trials. The match that everyone had expected to be a demonstration of human fragility had instead become the most anticipated bout in recent history. The arena was packed beyond capacity. Every species in the Confederation had representatives present. The betting pools had more money flowing through them than some planetary economies. This was no longer just about the trials. This was about humanity's place in the galaxy. Sral was everything. Thorax had been, but refined to perfection. Faster, stronger, smarter. His exoskeleton bore the marks of countless battles, each scar a lesson learned and adapted to. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never lost, who had no reason to believe he ever would. But he had watched Riko's fights. He knew she was dangerous. He would not make the same mistakes as Thorax. The opening moments of the match were tense, both fighters circling, analyzing. Esral feinted attacks, testing her reactions. Riko countered with false openings, seeing if he would take the bait. The crowd was silent, watching two high-level fighters engage in a chess match before the real violence began. When they finally engaged, it was explosive. Esral was faster than any opponent Riko had faced, his four arms creating a lattice of attacks that seemed impossible to navigate. But Riko moved through them, taking glancing hits on her arms and shoulders while protecting her core. She was bleeding within the first minute, her human skin splitting under impacts that would have bounced harmlessly off most species. But every exchange gave her information. Every attack pattern showed her his rhythms, and slowly, painfully, she began to adapt. The turning point came in the 7th minute. Esral committed to a powerful combination, his confidence in his speed making him just slightly overextend. Riko slipped the final strike and countered with a punch to his primary knee joint. Not his strongest attack, but perfectly placed. The joint buckled, not breaking, but definitely damaged. Esral's eyes widened in his compound vision. That had hurt. Actually hurt. Riko pressed the advantage. She had learned from Thorax's fight, knew where Zithra exoskeletons were weakest. Every strike targeted those points. Joints, eye clusters, mandible connections. She was painting a masterpiece in violence, each brushstroke precise and purposeful. But Esral was a champion for a reason. Even damaged, even hurt, he was dangerous. He caught Riko with a solid strike to her midsection that lifted her off her feet and sent her crashing down meters away. The impact would have killed most humans. Riko's medical readouts showed massive trauma, potential organ damage, dangerous internal bleeding. She got up. Slower this time, clearly in agony. But she got up. The crowd was going insane. The noise level was deafening. In the luxury boxes, the High Arbiter was on his feet, his usual composure completely abandoned. The xenobiologists had given up trying to explain what they were seeing and were just watching like everyone else. Riko and Esral met in the center of the arena again. Both were damaged. Both were exhausted. Both knew the next exchange would likely decide everything. They moved together in a final, desperate clash. Esral's four arms sought to grab, to crush. Riko twisted through his attack and drove her fist into the crack she had created earlier in his chest plate. Once, twice, 3 times, each punch landing in the exact same spot with piledriver precision. The crack widened, spread, and then, with a sound that would echo in the arena's memory banks forever, Esral's chest plate fractured. Not shattered, not destroyed, but visibly, undeniably broken. Esral froze. In 5 trials, across dozens of matches, his armor had never failed. Never. And this human, this impossibly fragile human, had broken it with nothing but her fists and her will. Riko stepped back, swaying slightly, blood running down her face from a dozen cuts. She raised her hands again, ready to continue despite looking like she could barely stand. Esral looked at her. Really looked at her. Saw the determination, the refusal to quit, the absolute certainty that she would keep fighting until either she won or her body completely gave out. He saw what it meant to be human. Slowly, his arms lowered. "I yield," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. The arena exploded. The noise was beyond description. A human had won the trials of dominance. An impossible, unthinkable statistical anomaly human had defeated the galaxy's finest warriors through nothing but skill, determination, and an apparently genetic inability to know when to quit. Riko barely registered the victory. The moment the fight ended, her adrenaline crashed, and she collapsed. The medical team swarmed her immediately, rushing her to the regeneration tanks. The damage she had taken would require weeks of healing, even with advanced Confederation medicine. But she had won. In the aftermath, as the galaxy tried to process what had happened, the reassessment of humanity began in earnest. Every assumption was questioned. Every military calculation redone. The species that had been dismissed as weak, as fragile, as barely worth noticing, had just proven they were perhaps the most dangerous of all. Because they didn't have natural armor, they had learned to fight smarter. Because they were fragile, they had learned to be precise. Because they could be hurt, they had developed a pain tolerance that bordered on terrifying. And because they were persistence hunters who didn't know when to quit, they would keep coming long after any sensible species would have surrendered. The Confederation's military advisors quietly updated their threat assessments. Humanity moved from negligible to handle with extreme caution. The High Arbiter, in a private conversation with the human coordinator, asked the question that everyone was wondering. Where did you find her? What kind of training produces a warrior like that? The coordinator smiled. Oh, Riko? She runs a gym back on Earth, teaches self-defense classes to teenagers. This was her vacation. The High Arbiter's gills stopped functioning for a full 5 seconds. Her vacation, he repeated slowly. Yeah, she thought it would be fun. Something different. The coordinator paused. She asked me to tell you the tournament was great, by the way, very well organized. She's hoping to come back next cycle if her work schedule allows. The High Arbiter made a note to possibly reconsider the entire concept of the trials. Maybe make them less combat-oriented. Perhaps more of a cultural exchange. Something that wouldn't result in the galaxy's finest warriors being systematically dismantled by a human gym teacher on holiday. 3 weeks later, after Riko had healed and returned to Earth, the Confederation's intelligence services finally got their hands on Earth's internet. What they found there would have been concerning if it hadn't been so ridiculous. Humans fought each other for sport, regularly, in dozens of different styles. They had entire organizations dedicated to watching people punch each other. They filmed it. They cheered for it. They bet on it. Worse, Riko Martinez was barely exceptional by human standards. She was good, certainly, a professional with years of experience. But Earth had thousands of fighters of similar or greater skill, and that was just the professionals. Millions of humans trained in combat sports as a hobby. The galaxy had welcomed humanity thinking they were adopting a cute, harmless species that needed protection. They had actually invited a planet full of warriors who fought each other for fun. The Confederation's military advisors updated their threat assessments again. Humanity moved from handle with extreme caution to do not provoke under any circumstances. And somewhere on Earth, in a small gym in a city whose name the Confederation couldn't pronounce, Riko Martinez taught a class of teenagers how to throw a proper punch, completely unaware that she had fundamentally altered humanity's position in galactic politics. The trials of dominance continued the next cycle, of course. Traditions that old didn't just stop. But there was a noticeable increase in competitors who suddenly remembered pressing obligations that prevented their participation. Mysterious injuries, scheduling conflicts, anything to avoid the possibility of facing another human. Because the galaxy had learned an important lesson. One that would be taught in Confederation academies for generations to come. Just because something looks fragile doesn't mean it can't break you. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who have learned to thrive despite their weaknesses. Sometimes the scariest warriors are the ones who refuse to acknowledge when they're beaten.